The next movement that we want to look at, the last kick that we want to look at for now, is this outside chopping kick, where we kick out with the outside of the foot. And back in the day we used to call this the blade of the foot. When you were learning martial arts 30 years ago or something, you're doing a side kick, they call it the blade of the foot. But this isn't a side kick, obviously, we're kicking outside with the blade of the foot. Helpfully highlighted there if you don't know where my foot is. In any case, there are a few interesting things to think about with this kick. And one is the much more advanced idea of how the kick roots. So how you form this structure so that you can lock it against the floor. And remember that for Fa Li, it's not like you see all these arguments on the internet about what Fa Li is. It's not like we have that argument in Yiquan, or we shouldn't, because Wang Xiangjia is explicitly clear about what he means by this concept. You release force, power comes from the kinetic movement of the body. It doesn't come from the floor. How could power come from the floor? What, like some kind of spiritual force rises up through your leg? No, power comes from the kinetic movement of the body. Then you suddenly lock the structure and transmit the force to the opponent. And remember that I gave that quote from Wang Xiangjia where he's explaining that this is the absolute core element of how we understand force transmission in Yiquan. And one of the hardest things to get, particularly with kicks, which are massive movements, so they create not just kinetic force, but you're swinging your leg out, so you get that kind of centrifugal force as well. One of the hardest things to achieve physically is this ability to suddenly stop the whole structure and transmit the force. That's what we call the lock point, and there are massive shearing forces when you do that on your own body. The human body is capable of generating far more power than the average human body itself can contain, so it's very easy. Even if someone could just learn how to do this immediately, put the programming in their mind, their physical structure would not be strong enough to control all those shearing forces. They'd be pulling muscles left, right and centre. Not just pulling muscles, but actually tearing tendons and tearing muscles, because the human body is capable of an immense amount of force, relatively speaking, certainly relative to what people think it's capable of. And so something else to be very wary of is these people who say things like, oh well, in Yiquan we don't have round kicks, or in Yiquan we don't have high kicks and stuff like that. Actually, those are all techniques, so Yiquan is no techniques and all techniques. It's about core physical movement, not about specific techniques. Although I did see one person saying that the core movement principles of Yiquan prevent you from doing a round kick. So beware this, because the easiest way of promoting yourself is to take all of your own limitations and say that they are the limitations of Yiquan itself, i.e. you've achieved the highest level. Like people who can't bring their Yiquan into sparring will say you don't need to do sparring. People who can't do a round kick with the principles of Yiquan will say you can't do a round kick in Yiquan. People who aren't flexible, who can't use chin na, they will say these things have no place in Yiquan. They redefine it according to their own limitations. Whereas the whole point is that there are no limitations. The only limitations are human capability itself. And that's why we have this concept of emergence, so we know or hope that people in the future generations can be far higher level than the previous generations. In any case, when we use a kick and we hit that lock point that Wang Xiangjia is describing, there's a range of quite complex forces involved. And the feeling of using Bao and Fa Li and hitting the lock point is very much that. It's very much a feeling that you've got to get. And like Yao Zhongzhun said, this kind of wushu can't be stolen, so you can't just see it and copy it. You've got to get the feeling yourself. And people always want a singular solution to this, like how do you do it? Well, actually, the whole point of the art is that every configuration is different. Every configuration requires a different balance of shearing forces, explosive movement, structure, balance, weighting, lock point. The art isn't to learn all of those for every specific technique. The art is the ability to fluidly adapt to whatever the configuration is in that moment. Of course, we learn how to do those configurations that we use all the time, like basic techniques, but from there we need to learn how to fluidly adapt and improvise in whatever variation of a configuration we need in a particular moment. That's the art. That's why it's not about techniques. And then things change when you start doing combinations as well. Something to look out for is Yiquan people who only do single release force. I've mentioned this before and we'll look at it again when we come to look at Farley. You have to be able to release force in combinations. This is the whole point, particularly of Yao Zhongzun's innovations in Yiquan practice, and that's why we find Yao Zhongzun talking about this particularly, how to use combinations with principles of Yiquan. Single posture release force, even if you're kind of doing Jamwu or something like that and you just keep doing single posture release force, it's always it's a level you've got to move up from because you've got to start moving into combinations. Anyway, that's a whole other story. What we need to think about is the chopping out side kick, and this isn't a technique that we would normally use, and it requires a higher level of cultivation than other basic kicks anyway, because the structure of the leg's got to be just right, otherwise you'll injure yourself. We'll talk about that in a moment. But this is a little bit unusual. For a front kick, a round kick or a side kick, you kind of kick out to the full extension of the leg. Well, you leave it a little bit curved, you don't lock against the bones. But with this kick, you could go further. Your leg could just spin all the way round out to the side, and the quad could open a lot more, and you've got to kind of stop it. You can see there, you've got to kind of stop it dead right on the centre line. And the way we achieve that sudden stop isn't really obvious from looking at it visually, because it looks like the whole body is turning in line with the kick, like the whole torso is turning to the left. And the way we achieve that, although it's not completely obvious just from looking at it, is through oppositional force. Looking at it, it looks like the whole torso is going in line with the kick. In this case, left kick, everything turning towards the left. Actually, if you look carefully at the right arm, you can see that just at the lock point, we release force backwards with the right shoulder. It's just that the way the body is structured, it doesn't twist our whole torso backwards, it just locks it into place at that point. Okay, so the next thing to say is that the easiest way to use this posture is without very much power, just giving someone a little dig to the side as they're stepping in. If they're stepping and there's no weight on the leg, you can move it quite easily. So in sparring and stuff like that, you can just give it a dig from the side and you don't have to put a massive amount of power in. But one of the things that people very often say to me is, well, is it possible to actually hit with force with this kick? Wouldn't it really hurt your leg? And the answer is yes, you can. So have a look at this. And now have a look again at my structure. So this is a kick that you wouldn't feel comfortable teaching other people. I don't feel comfortable getting other people to do this because it's so easy to hurt yourself. If you look at my structure, it's rounded. And it doesn't always look like that, but I can assure you that I'm not straightening any of the joints, and that's the key to this, maintaining bow in the legs, maintaining that sense of all the joints being slightly bent. If you don't, I'm telling you, you could just easily pop your knee. You could do yourself a proper mischief with this. It's a much higher level of cultivation to be able to do this posture. So I'm not saying doing it, I'm just telling you how I do it. And once I kind of got it on the air, then I just brought it into lighter bag work. Just letting the bag give me the feedback, tell me where the structure's right or wrong. And then I just built it up to half power. And then gradually practical use level power. Okay, so if you get up to that point, then that's basically the first level of cultivation with this kick, and you'll be doing the kick and then probably just dropping the foot straight down, and that's absolutely fine at first, because when you lock the whole body, use that twisting oppositional force to lock the kick at the lock point, then it's very difficult to do anything else but just drop the foot down. It's a very difficult posture in itself. But as you develop and cultivate a little bit higher, try and get a little bit of a semicircle on it. So semicircle up and then semicircle down, so you wouldn't clash with the opponent's foot, keeping it all under control. It's hard to see when you do it fast, but getting a little bit of a semicircle up and then a little bit of a semicircle down, you can see it fairly clearly there. And that's so you can hit in without hitting the opponent's leg, and then hit in and come back down again, hopefully not scraping down the opponent's leg. So it takes a little bit of practice to get that, to add that in. So that's the next step of cultivation with this posture. Then, as per usual, bring it into more lively movement, so you're moving step by step towards live practice. Just bringing it in with more active footwork, imagining, visualising an opponent there, and just feeling how it changes the way that the whole posture is stacked. Now, with the back foot, we can learn something really interesting, because you can do it with the back foot, but one of the key ideas that Wang Xiangjai talks about is that when you hit an opponent, you've got to manage the force that's generated. So the way we configure our structures, the way we stack our postures to create the configuration, has always got to take into account the force that's coming back into our body, and that's something you don't get just from doing Jamwu or something like that. I sounded a bit angry then, I could hear it in my own voice. I am a bit sick of, aren't we all? A bit sick of seeing people just waving their arms about in the air and then going on with themselves about how great they are. I'm weary, I'm not angry with them. I want them to move forward on the path. It's dependent arising. We're all interlinked. Cultivation is a social project. We're all interlinked. If other people get better, I can get better. In any case, because of the oddness of this posture, if you do it with power with the back foot, it has a very interesting effect. So take a look at this. Did you see how it pushed me over to the side? That's oppositional force. I can't control that force because of the nature of my structure. And if you do it really hard, you'll do that. You'll spin right round with it. Look at it again. There's really no way to brace the posture because of the way that it's stacked. You can't brace it against the floor, so you lose all that energy. That energy's got to go somewhere. So when Wang Xiangjai says rebound energy, you structure the posture in such a way that the energy goes back into the target. Whereas you can see here, the energy is just going bing, just pinging me off to the side. And that tells you, first of all, thanks dog, that tells you, first of all, be very careful if you do it with the rear foot and you do it with power, because that would obviously be disastrous. But it also tells you about how postures should be structured and rooted. It tells you something about how the genius of the idea of structural movement and this concept of rebound energy and the way we think about force and how much force can be lost if there's looseness in the structure, because that's a really big example with your foot pinging off to the side. But exactly the same thing happens if a joint is wobbly or it's out of alignment or something like that. You just lose energy. And a big part of the art of Yiquan is tightening up all those things. Not so far that your structure becomes brittle, but not so loose that you dissipate too much energy. And there's a doctrine of the mean somewhere in between, which Wang Xiangjai talks about on multiple occasions. And then finally, moving back to the front leg, better than a rear leg kick, front leg, but if you've got to close that distance, a little push step is ideal. It just fits perfectly, helps you set the posture spot on. Remember that the rear foot doesn't go past the front foot, it comes up to the heel. And if you look carefully at the heel, the rear foot, you can see it setting down into the floor, like slamming down into the floor.